This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the 9th of June, 2024. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks.
I'm Michael Wade.
And we are here. I have to apologize for last week. We actually did a live show, and you can actually see it on YouTube now. For some reason, well, I know what the reason was. If you may remember, 3 weeks ago, we started the podcast. There was some technical issues. We had no sound. For some reason, all of my sound settings got reset on my computer without any human intervention. So rather than showing the live version, I downloaded it, edited the first part of it out, and just picked up from where we did a formal restart. And I set the live version to unlisted, which means you can't see it and don't have access to it. So when I copied last week's podcast, it copied all the settings from the previous week, which were unlisted. And so therefore I was watching and there's nobody watching. There's no viewers. Nothing is happening. Nothing is on. What is going on? And, then I saw up here at the top, as I look at my screen on YouTube here, it said, privacy, unlisted. Well, that explains why no one is watching. So we did a live podcast last week, but one that no one could see. This time, it looks like we have viewers, so we have a live podcast. So, hey, guess what? We're live. We did it right this time. Oh, goodness. There are a lot of moving parts to making this thing work the way it's supposed to work. Well, let's start off with a quick story. I'm not even concerned about the story itself, except that it does need some background. I guess it was day before yesterday at this point, right, where the Israelis apparently received intelligence that 4 of the hostages were being held in a quote-unquote refugee camp in quote-unquote civilian homes. And so the Israelis worked out a way to get in there. They basically disguised themselves as humanitarian aid workers, drove in, then they assaulted the civilian residences where the hostages were being held, rescued them, had to fight their way out. At this point, Hamas says about 274 Palestinians were killed as the Israelis had to fight their way out of this refugee camp. Why?
That's like Rambo numbers.
Yeah, I'm just curious as to why they had to, quote unquote, fight these civilians to get out. That's an interesting question. However, I'm not so concerned about that operation itself. What I am interested in is the response we've gotten. Now, this fellow right here, this lady right here, is a UN Special Rapporteur. She's an international lawyer, you see, and a scholar. Relieved that 4 hostages have been released. Well, we have to stop right there. No hostages were released. These hostages were rescued. We don't ask why there were hostages there in the first place, but about that more in due course. At least 200 Palestinians, including children, were killed, over 400 injured in Israel, and allegedly foreign soldiers, not sure where that came from, while perfidiously hiding in an aid truck. This is humanitarian camouflage at another level. Why were there hostages in the first place? Why were they in this refugee camp? Why were they being held by civilians? Oh, by the way, newsflash. If you hide hostages in the basement of your civilian home, congratulations, you've just become a combatant. You're now actively taking part in a Hamas military operation. That kind of sucks for you if the Israelis figure out where their hostages are. Israel has used hostages to legitimize killing, injuring, maiming, starving, and traumatizing Palestinians in Gaza. Yes, it's a casus belli. It is a cause for war. So, yes, they are using those hostages, not to mention the October 7th attack, which we don't seem to have her mention here. And then she goes in with this. Israel could have freed all the hostages 8 months ago when the first ceasefire and hostage exchange was put on the table. Yes, if you wanted to submit to Hamas blackmail at that time, sure. I suppose that's technically true. It just would have required a complete surrender to Hamas and no consequences for the October 7th attacks whatsoever. They get off scot-free. Turns out the hostages as a bargaining chip didn't work, and by the way, in my view, shouldn't work. And of course, this is genocidal intent turned into action. So, quick question for you. If there is this genocidal intent, why did Israel withdraw in 2005 from the Gaza Strip completely?
Yeah, why does it warn civilians of where it's going to be active? Why does it drop leaflets days before an attack?
Yeah, well, we'll elide past those questions. Another UN rapporteur says that countries that celebrate the release of 4 Israeli hostages without saying a word about the hundreds of Palestinians killed and thousands held in arbitrary detention by Israel. Well, okay. That's a different topic, and arbitrary covers a lot of ground in that sentence, but we'll elide past that too. But those countries have lost moral credibility for generation and don't deserve to be on any human rights body. Obviously, nations that deserve to be on the human rights body are nations like Iran, who chaired it a couple of years ago. Their human rights record is fine. They can be on a human rights body, but whatever you do, don't celebrate Israel in any way. And then, of course, the Vice President of the United States. She mourns the death of Palestinians in a raid that rescued 4 Israeli hostages. And if you read the story, which I was able to read 10 minutes ago, but apparently I have now reached my maximum free account here. Basically, she said, yes, we're glad the Israelis have their hostages home, but we mourn all of the Palestinians who died. Well, look, I suppose so. I mean, I suppose we do mourn, unnecessary civilian deaths. The assignment of blame for those deaths, I think, is a much more complex issue than we give it credit for.
Yeah, I mean, what's been the super viral phrase lately, FAFO. And so that's what happened on October 7th, and now they're in the find out part.
By the way, I'm not sure what this comment means, but in chat, Dale needs to tell Michael where to buy t-shirts. I don't know what that means, but it's hilarious. Maybe it's because maybe your t-shirt is, it's got maybe an older t-shirt. You know what? We wear what we wear. Deal with it. I am all for a rules-based international order, especially when it comes to the law of armed conflict and the conduct of soldiers on the battlefield. War is brutal. It is awful. It is built entirely around destruction and death. That is its purpose. And the point of some sort of rules-based order to govern the activities of combatants is a good idea in principle. And it would work out great if wars were fought between countries who adhere to those various conventions, the first, second, and third Geneva Conventions, etc., etc. The trouble is, as far as I can tell, the nations that sign these types of agreements tend to be not the nations to which with which we go to war.
Not against, anyway.
Yeah, not against. Which leaves one to wonder, is it morally incumbent upon us to treat, say, the Geneva Conventions, to which the United States is a signatory, is it incumbent upon us to impose those rules on ourselves when fighting adversaries who ignore them at will? Because that is, in effect, what Hamas does, right? I mean, they ignore the Geneva Conventions at will. The October 7th attack, not only was an unprovoked attack, which would be a violation of the law of armed conflict.
During a ceasefire.
Yeah, during a ceasefire. So it was a break of a ceasefire. It was an attack directly on civilians. Civilians were intentionally murdered during this attack, and civilians were kidnapped and returned to Gaza as pawns, a violation, again, of the Geneva Conventions and other rules for the protection of non-combatants in zones of conflict.
Yeah, under international law, every one of those actions is considered a war crime.
That is correct. They're all war crimes. Is a rules-based international order supposed to be a suicide pact that we sign? Because the downside of signing on to something like the Geneva Conventions is that simply by doing so, it creates an expectation of what your behavior on the battlefield will be in pretty much every situation. I mean, you've signed on to these internationally agreed upon rules of conflict, and you have said, we will sign on to them and we will participate according to these rules. And that's all well and good, and the expectation that you'll do that is well and good, assuming you're fighting with someone who obeys those rules. But what moral responsibility do we have of abiding by those rules when fighting combatants who will hide armaments in schools and hospitals and churches or mosques, as the case may be, who use civilians as shields? At what point do we say, or do we say, that these rules can't apply to us in this conflict? At what point does the general moral principle of reciprocity, which I've talked about before, at what point does that begin to be a necessary part of your war making?
Yeah, well, I mean, whenever fighting a guerrilla war, which is essentially what we're doing, what we did in Vietnam, we have to, take into account. Well, I mean, the American Revolution, we fought a guerrilla war in relation to the Brits.
Well,
you do
not
have to
entirely.
take into
I
account.
mean, we did have an army in being.
That's true, and they were in uniform. They were identifiable as combatants. We treated prisoners of war humanely. But the tactics that we used were certainly a little more guerrilla. Although not like in Vietnam or anywhere in the Middle East, Afghanistan. It's just pure mayhem, and anything that could be done to frustrate the other side, and try as much as possible when they don't live up to the rules that they've sworn by, and try to garner international opprobrium. I do think that if they're not going to follow the rules, I think that our rules of engagement should be changed, should be lowered, for our own safety, and to put an end to it as quickly as possible. I mean, the worst thing that can happen in any war is for it to go on too long. The more quickly you can get capitulation, the fewer people will die. So if that's what it takes to be absolutely horrendous, and just bomb the shit out of stuff until they give up, I'd love to do it another way, but if that's the only way it's going to work, that's the only way it's going to work.
Well, that was the tactic that we employed with the 8th Air Force in Europe, and the 3rd Air Force in Italy, and the 20th Air Force in the Pacific. We just basically bombed civilian targets. Most people don't realize that. People talk about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as if it was uniquely horrific. We killed far more people firebombing Tokyo in a single raid than were killed at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. I mean, there is some estimates that we killed 250,000 people in Tokyo in a single night. That's not pretty, but again, we were also fighting an enemy that repudiated the Geneva Conventions.
Mm-hmm.
And
was entrenched and war hungry, essentially.
Yeah, and people often elide past the fact that they didn't quit after we dropped the first bomb.
That's right. That's why there were two.
Which tells us something that's instructive in a way. But that it is this. I don't know whether it is I hesitate to use the term racist because I don't think that's fully applicable here. But it's interesting that third world countries seem to receive an exemption from playing by the rules. And first world countries don't. Advanced countries are held to this high moral standard. And so when you see things like these UN special rapporteurs decrying how this operation was carried out, and they disguised themselves as humanitarian aid workers when they entered this civilian area, it couldn't possibly be because they didn't want to fight their way in through civilian area, that they just wanted to go in, do a surgical raid, grab these hostages, and move out. And they're fighting an enemy who literally uses hospitals, schools, and mosques as arms storage areas.
Yep.
So why do we have to treat our enemies with the same respect as we would treat an enemy who complies with the laws of war? I can't for the life of me figure out why. And I think it is part of the moral rot of the West that we just assume that we have this responsibility higher than any other to be purer than Caesar's wife whenever we conduct these operations.
Well, it's part of the leftist worldview that everybody is in one of two groups, oppressor or oppressed. And they look at everything in terms of power dynamics. Well, they're just poor little countries. They can't really, afford to fight like that. Well, then why do they do it? I mean, maybe they should consider that before they make these attacks. You don't go up to a bully and bite him on the knee and expect him not to pound you into submission. You really need to consider what it is these people are trying to accomplish. And in the case of Hamas, it's the complete destruction of Israel. With the backing of Iran, of course.
It's difficult to explain why Hamas would have done what it did unless they expected that, any responsibility for war crimes on their part would be ignored. It seems to me that you only do that when you have the full expectation that the rules don't apply to you, but they will be applied to whoever you're fighting, and so therefore you will use those rules to your advantage. And the entire strategy of Hamas for the last 7 months has been to use the rules-based international order to get away with conducting war crimes. And it's
absolutely.
And it's difficult to see how that can be countenanced by any rational person.
Yeah, in group dynamics, it's called the tyranny of the lowest common denominator, where the person with the least amount of power in the group actually kind of controls the group through his or her victimhood status. And so they get special rules, and everybody else has to. Well, you're the bigger person. You're the better person, so you have to act this way. And it's, we just have to deal with the fact that they act that way. But, we can't resort to any kind of punitive measures. Well, it's bullshit because then all you're doing is letting the runt of the litter run everything.
Yeah, but in this case, it's worse than the runt of the litter or the most powerless of the litter. It is a cynical attempt to basically commit war crimes while demanding that, here's the thing. You reject any responsibility for conducting operations according to the generally accepted international rules. But you then demand that the people who you are breaking the rules of war to fight still have to live by those same rules. You've got this set of rules you live by. We have this special set that we're allowed to do basically anything we want. And we're going to claim the protections of the rules-based international order while flouting them at every opportunity. It doesn't seem to me that we should allow
it doesn't
that.
hold up.
It doesn't hold up.
It's
if you decide that you are going to break the rules, you then don't get to turn around and claim protection from those same rules.
Right. There's a long-standing doctrine of law called the clean hands doctrine that, if you enter into this transaction by fraudulent or other unlawful means, then you don't get the benefit of the protections. You went in with unclean hands. Well, you got what you got.
Right. So your contract is not enforceable if you decide someone broke that contract.
Not against the other person. That's right.
Although it is enforceable against you. And it seems to me the international order should react the same way. I would really like to have something. And by the way, there is something, at least in terms of unlawful combatants, where it says if you get caught as an unlawful combatant, we can put you in front of, two captains and a major, and we can have you shot.
Yeah.
Because we have rules, and if you don't go by those rules, you don't have any protection under the Geneva Convention as an unlawful combatant. We don't do that clearly enough, I think, in the conventions for countries.
Yeah, I think that's true. And again, our rules of engagement are controlled a lot by those conventions. So we basically go into these things with one arm tied behind our back.
Which would be fine if we were fighting Great Britain.
Right.
Because we're both signatories to all three of the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Convention. So we have a reasonable certitude that everything is going to be fought in an above-board way, and that our POWs are going to be treated properly, et cetera, et cetera. The second you walk into Kaplakistan, those rules go out the window because you're going to be fighting an enemy that's not going to obey them.
Yeah.
And I think there should be more of a realization. Now, as far as the UN goes, well, we know why they're making the statements they're making, why they're talking about these hostages being released, because it's a perversion of the language for political purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought that was an interesting response to the Israeli action, to going into a civilian area where hostages were being held by civilians, but they're not allowed to do that. Well, what about the people who are holding the hostages? What are they not allowed to do? Because it seems to me one of the things they're not allowed to do is hold hostages.
Yeah, that kind of goes with the territory.
Yeah, so if you make yourself a combatant, I got bad news for you. You're a combatant. Anyway,
it wasn't shocking to see that kind of reaction at all. This is what Israel's been dealing with since 1948.
No, but here's the thing. It's not just Israel. Because if you look back on our operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we were held to that same standard as well.
Yeah, and in Kuwait.
And our rules of engagement were highly restrictive in many cases because of that. I mean, there were times when we knew that insurgents in Iraq were hiding weapons in mosques and we couldn't touch them, because that would be a violation of the rules.
although it's already a violation of the rules to hide those things
Yeah, but
in a place of worship.
yeah, I mean, they get to violate the rules, but we have to play by the rules. The law of armed conflict is not a suicide pact, and the fact that we treat it as such is a sign of the decadence of our civilization. And I think we'll leave that one.
Well, it's
there.
also why we have never-ending wars. I mean, how do you finish a war if you can't actually defeat the enemy through normal, just regular military means with restrictive rules of engagement and stuff? There's just really no way to finish it off.
No, and so you end up spending 20 years in Afghanistan and literally end it on the day you pull out at status quo ante.
Yeah.
So 20 years of warfare in Afghanistan that accomplished literally nothing. Good job.
Got a lot of people killed.
Yeah. Yeah, which again is why I am all for going back to Victorian England's policy of punitive invasions. We go in, we kill whoever we think is responsible for the problem, we leave, and we have no responsibility to rebuild your shit. We wouldn't be there if you hadn't made us come there, and since you made us come there, you broke it, you broke it, you bought it.
Yeah. Yeah, not the Colin Powell, Pottery Barn thing.
Yeah.
Well, if we broke it, we got to fix it. Well, it was already broken when we got there.
No, they broke it. They get to fix it. So, yeah, I fully believe in the Pottery Barn rule, but you have to correctly assign responsibility for who broke it.
Absolutely.
And it's not the people who, it's not the people who.
Well, that's why we say that, all this bloodshed in Gaza is on Hamas. They are the ones that started this. They are the ones that brought this horror upon their own people. It's their fault, and Iran's.
Look, there's something, and it's not irrational. Turns out it was wrong, but it's not irrational to think, look, we can launch an attack, make it as horrific as you want. Just bring back a couple of hundred casualties. Because now we can use those casualties as human shields, and they won't act against us for fear of us killing the hostages. Because they'll be too subject to public pressure, which, by the way, we are not, because we run this country like our own personal dog kennel. But they will be subject to public pressures to ensure that the hostages don't get harmed. So basically, we can do what we want. As long as we bring enough hostages back and hide them over here, we can prevent any sort of large-scale retaliation. That turned out to be an incorrect assessment of what was going to happen. But it's not an irrational assessment.
No. It really does depend on who you're going up against. I remember the Chechens thought sort of a similar thing. And Russians were like, yeah, that was a bad gamble.
The Chechen situation seems to have been less rational. Unless you think that the Russian Federation of the 1990s was not going to react similarly to the way that the Soviet Union would have reacted.
Yeah.
You'd have thought, the Russians have...
that did seem a little over the top.
Yeah, for whatever reason, the Russians have become weak and they'll do nothing. Well, the thing is, prior to the Soviet Union, the Russians would have done something. And as it turned out, after the Soviet Union, they still would have done something.
Same thing.
And boy...
Yeah, they don't care if you have hostages. All right, well, we just consider them dead.
Yeah. Okay, well, as far as we're concerned, they're dead. It's our job to kill you now. Pour encourager les autres, as our French revolutionaries used to say. And it worked. Look, the Russian campaign in Chechnya was, by any standard in terms of damage to civilian lives and properties, a disaster. It was absolutely horrific for the Chechen civilian population. The difference is the Russians didn't care. The Russians wanted,
had no concerns.
What the Russians wanted was to end the secessionist movement in Chechnya. And the way that they figured they would do that would be basically to kill every third person in Chechnya, which they proceeded to do without mercy.
Hmm.
One notes that Chechnya is still a member of the Russian Federation.
They're not
So
happy about it, but yeah, it
they're not
still
happy
is.
about it, but they don't want to do that again. So there may be lessons there. Although
Mm.
I think by any stretch of the imagination, you would have to say that the Russians went farther than was strictly necessary.
Yeah, it was pretty awfully brutal.
Yeah, the Russians just didn't care. Um, which always brings up the interesting question. And I was going to try to go past this, but now we've brought up an interesting question. Where do you draw the line? If you've decided we're fighting someone who basically breaks the Geneva Conventions all the time, we can't allow them to use those rules against us while exempting themselves from them, then the question becomes, how far do you go?
I mean, I think on the battlefield, anything goes. Capture prisoners. I think we do have a moral duty to treat them humanely. Um, but on the battlefield, I mean, you got to do what you got to do. We need that city. We need that hill. Well, we're going to get it come hell or high water. And if that means we got to kill a bunch of people, well, I mean, them's the breaks.
Yeah,
You
but
could give
again,
it up.
again, it goes back. It's an interesting post World War II fact. The Brits put up statues to Hugh Mallory, Montgomery, a whole bunch of British generals and field marshals. There's one person who didn't get a single statue, and that was Arthur Bomber Harris, the air marshal who was in charge of Bomber Command, and who was essentially bombing German cities by day for 5 years.
Lit up Dresden. Yeah.
Yeah, there seems to have been some sense of shame, at least to the extent that they wouldn't honor Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris at the end of World War II, even though one could argue that he was one of the more instrumental British commanders in ensuring that Germany's ability to fight was, repressed fairly brutally. Um, when you say anything goes on the battlefield, and having served 10 years on active duty myself in line units, you can't let anything go on the battlefield. There has to be some constraints on what you're allowed to do, both tactically and strategically, on the battlefield. So in World War II, the 8th Air Force, I mean, the official name for their bombing campaign in like 43 and 44 was dehousing. We're not trying to kill civilians, but we are trying to level every German city so that they have no place to live. And hopefully that will cripple their war-making capacity. Okay, is that something we're supposed to do? Is that acceptable? And you can draw moral calculus to the guy who's making bombs in a bomb factory is, at least in some way, a quasi-combatant in that he is part of. I mean, he's directly a part of the war-making capacity of the country. Okay, what about bombing farms?
Food supply.
Yeah, food supply. I mean, it's difficult to draw that moral line, and I think one of the reasons that Western nations are very comfortable with the Geneva and the Hague Conventions is that at least there are bright lines, right? That that you're not supposed to cross. Although, technically bombing civilian populations was a crossing of that bright line. Although the justification was, and it was true, the Germans started it.
Right. And let's be honest, too. I mean, the Geneva Conventions were honored, but not always. And, there was a lot of looking the other way at times on the battlefield. So,
And by
I
the
don't
way,
mind having that set of rules. I'd rather go back to at least the World War II rules of engagement.
inebriated Plutarch in chat says this is one of the reasons that we should not submit ourselves to foreign courts,
Amen.
like the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, that's run by the UN.
What a useless body.
Yeah, look, at some point, the principle of reciprocity has to apply. And then from there, you have to ask yourself the Sean Connery Untouchables question: how far are you willing to go? And that's always a tricky question. I certainly don't have any answers for it, but it seems to me that a blind obedience to the law of armed conflict when you're fighting someone who disregards it daily is probably not the best strategy. But you don't want your own soldiers to turn into, rampaging barbarians, killing.
And the soldiers
everything that
themselves
moves.
are not going to be comfortable with that either. Certainly not Western soldiers.
Well, that depends. I mean, even though Adolf Hitler did not consider Germany part of the West, it was pretty easy to get Germans to do some pretty horrific things, mainly in Russia, but they did some pretty horrific things.
The Russians did some pretty horrendous things
Yeah,
too.
well, again, the Germans started it.
Mm-hmm.
But the Germans started it. It became cover for all kinds of, horrific atrocities as the Russians moved into eastern part of Germany. So it's not a conversation we're going to solve, but it certainly is something that we should think about. We should keep in mind if it turns out that we become involved in a conflict or our allies become involved in a conflict. I think there needs to be more realpolitik and a little less ossified adherence to a set of rules when you're dealing with an enemy who doesn't respect those rules.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next topic, this memo that came out from the Biden administration to the Border Control or Border Patrol. Basically, the memo says there are some countries, and they name a few of them here, where it's really hard if we find illegal immigrants from those countries to send them back because those countries won't cooperate with us. We can't have flights back to their country. They won't cooperate on paperwork or anything else. It's hard. So here's what we're going to do. We're just going to release them into the country. So people from countries whose citizens might be inclined towards engaging in terrorist attacks are the very people that the Border Patrol can't hold. Those are the people they have to release into the population. And by the way, Fox News, Bill Malugin at Fox News has also been down at the border and just filmed literally hundreds and hundreds per day of illegal immigrants just being dropped off at the trolley station in downtown San Diego. This is a disaster. I have two questions about this. Number one, so why send them back to Uzbekistan? What border did we encounter them at? Well,
right.
That's the country to which we should return them.
Yep.
I mean, it doesn't really matter what country they come from. Originally, if they come in from Mexico, we send them back to Mexico. If they come in from Canada, which largely they don't, by the way, but then we'd send them back to Canada. This idea that we have to now, contact somebody in Tajikistan to try to get
completely
a flight back
repatriate them. Yeah, that's not our. It's not our job.
Our job is to get them out of this country, not get them back to not give them a free ride back to their home country. But it's interesting. I say interesting. It's horrific. The extent to which we've lost control of the border.
Yeah, I mean, we have no control over it at this point. And everything that's proposed by the Democrats, including the Biden administration, isn't to stop the flow. It's just to rename the people coming across the border. So we're just to legitimize them through some feat of administrative magic that they are now, free to roam around. They can get jobs. Eventually, they can vote, and that's what it's mostly about anyway. Eventually, they can vote.
You know what? It doesn't even have to be about eventually they can vote. They just have to be here because of the way the census works. Right? The census.
Yeah, there's that too.
Yeah, the census distributes political power in this country every 10 years via an apportionment of House seats. And it doesn't inquire into whether the resident of a state is a citizen or not. It's just the total number of residents. So therefore, a state like California, with a relatively large number of illegal immigrants, perhaps 7 to 10 million, then get to have another, 7 to 10 million at 700,000 per, gives you another 12 or 13 House seats. Mm-hmm. And these are 12 or 13 House seats in what is largely a liberal state. There are still red areas in California, but by and large, the vast number of representatives come from Los Angeles, Orange, Marin, San Francisco, Oakland counties. Although I don't think it's Oakland County, is it? I think Oakland's in another county. In any event, it doesn't really matter. The fact is that's where the bulk of the population is. In areas like San Francisco, 86% registered Democrat. Los Angeles, 77% registered Democrat. You know what party those representatives are going to support. So, A, you give an outsized support to a state that has a lot of illegal immigrants. Mm-hmm. I think it would be fascinating, if we could, to figure out how many actual citizens are in each state and to do the apportionment by the number of citizens present rather than the number of illegal immigrants present. Because
Trump tried to do that. It got shot down by the courts.
Yeah, because that would require basically a constitutional amendment. Because of the way
I still don't believe, but
because of the way the census is enumerated in the Constitution, well, you can make a colorable argument that the Constitution requires that you count the number of inhabitants, and that's not there's no distinction between, immigrants and citizens in that.
Well, we used to count, slaves as 3/5 of a person.
As 3/5 of a person, yes. But again, that was literally written into the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So that was plain black and white text. It's clear that Biden isn't going to do anything about the border. And
no.
The worry that I have is, at what point, what's the percentage of having illegal immigrants in this country where it starts to become a long-term societal problem? If you're going to, and political problem. The idea behind immigrants, and this is one of the things that the libertarians, and being largely of a libertarian bent myself, I understand it, and yet it irritates me, is this idea that, we need workers. And so we're going to pretend that all of these immigrants are just fungible economic units who have no ideas of their own about how women should be treated, or the value of democratic institutions, or even the value of the rule of law, or of limited government. We'll pretend that they have no ideas of their own on these issues, that all they are just worker bees who we will work, and they will do the jobs that, quote unquote, Americans won't do at that price. And we can allow as many people in as we want, and there will never be cultural or social or political problems from doing that. I think there's a number at which these problems follow.
Absolutely, especially when you look at the demographics of who's coming across the border. I mean, it's mostly young single men of fighting age. They really wanted to. You can join the U.S. military as a stepping stone to actually becoming a citizen. That is possible. but they don't seem to be coming here for that. We've also got a huge welfare system, and it's bigger in some states than others, such as California, Oregon, Washington, um, in Denver, at least, if not all of Colorado. And when they come in and they immediately start glomming off the system, well, that puts a burden on American citizens who actually need that help. And then look at the schools. The increase in the number of non-native English speakers in schools, especially in the Southwest, it's overwhelmed a lot of these places, and that costs taxpayers money as well. We're doing an awful lot to support an awful lot of people who don't belong here.
Over and above that, as a commenter in chat points out, imagine how many foreign agents have crossed the border. The Chinese could have an entire division in the country, most of them supported by the welfare state.
And I mean, they had their own police force in New York City.
Yeah, by the way, the number of Chinese immigrants that we're catching at the border is astonishing.
Yeah, it's exploded.
And as our Soviet friends used to say, it is no coincidence that they are coming over here. And I do not for a second believe that some unknown percentage of those Chinese immigrants are here at the behest of the Communist Party of China.
Yeah, I'm sure they're not reaching back to the motherland at all.
Yeah, so it's not only a social or cultural or budgetary or political problem, it's a national security issue. And that's even if we ignore everything else, the national security implications of an opened border where people from various countries in the Middle East and Asia are coming in, who do they work for? We don't know. And there's very little barrier to them getting in.
Yeah, I mean, look, if we went back to the way we did immigration in late 1800s, early 1900s, where there was no social welfare system, and you had to have a health check, and you had to have some means of employment. Could be from family, it could be you had a job, whatever, but you had to show that you could support yourself. And even after we implemented welfare, it used to be that you had to go 5 years at least before you could access any of those programs. So that would even be better than what we have now. Now we just have a wide open free-for-all.
And by the way, speaking of killing ourselves with kindness, is that we're basically giving a lot of these immigrants places to live for free.
Yeah.
And food
Free
and
food,
everything. And by the way,
phones.
they're complaining that it's not good enough.
Yeah, of course. I always try to bite the hand that feeds me.
Yeah, they had a protest in New York a couple of weeks ago of these immigrants who were just saying, we don't like the food you're giving us, and we don't like our accommodations. Well, if your great-grandfather
go home.
Go home. If your great-grandfather had come here, he would have liked the accommodations a lot less.
Mm-hmm.
Because he would have had to have come up with his own. And yet at the same time, we're letting these people come in. We're giving them housing and food and living stipends. Why wouldn't you come here?
Not to mention healthcare.
Yeah, we're not
schooling.
We're not going to stop you, and we're basically going to give you at least a subsistence lifestyle where you don't have to do a thing.
Well, I've been trying to do that to American citizens for a while too.
Yeah, well, they've there's nothing the Democratic Party would like more than a German or Danish style system of social welfare.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, next topic. And this one is a weird one because I'm not sure how to take it and what it means and how much of it is real and how much of it is exaggerated. So this week, 4.2 million infected chickens, the H5N1 avian flu virus. They're going to have to kill 4.2 million chickens in Iowa. They say
they eat them if they've been infected.
Apparently not. They
sucks.
Also are finding cases in alpacas, for goodness sakes. But it's not just alpacas, they're saying. They're also saying that cows have been infected and, in fact, have died in 5 U.S. states. There is also, and this I caught interestingly, I think it was from here or from, yeah, it's just, we're worried that the bird flu is going from cows to whatever. And a couple of people apparently have been diagnosed with H5N1. Nobody has died. There was a story this last week that a guy in Mexico had died of bird flu, but it turns out that this guy was real sick. Had diabetes, kidney failure, and whatever. It's the milk. There was an interesting thing on the milk. They want to test milk for H5N1. And maybe it's the LA Times story where they've detected bird flu here in California, in San Francisco. And it is, there's something about milk. Yes. Pasteurization kills the virus. However, high levels have been found in raw milk, and cats and mice that drank raw milk from infected cows had high mortality rates. It's rare that a disease crosses the species barrier like that. Most of the diseases for birds are, bird specific, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're being told that this disease is now showing up in cows and in alpacas, and we're finding it in milk, which means that it could get into the food supply. All of which is well and good. And look, these are both state and federal agricultural authorities, so it's more than just the USDA and the FDA who are sounding these warnings about bird flu. But I gotta wonder how much they're trying to scare us about bird flu crossing over into humans in order to go back to the good old days of COVID.
It sure seems like that, doesn't it? I mean, fool me once, shame on me. But I mean, it's the WHO seems to be spearheading this push, and that automatically makes me distrust the whole thing. It doesn't mean that we don't have some sort of issue going on, but I'm just not buying it. That it's as widespread or as serious as what they're saying.
But they keep saying it.
Mm-hmm.
And especially the WHO with this new treaty that Joe Biden agreed to, by the way, that basically allows the WHO to, well, more or less essentially control your entire healthcare system.
Yeah, that's not okay.
And so this bird flu thing has been around for a long time. Most people have probably forgotten, but back in 2002, 2003, this bird flu thing was a big deal in Asia. But even then, they never went as overboard as we went with COVID. And the thing that worries me when you talk about all this bird flu, well, it's spreading to alpacas and now cows. And look, rats and cats can get it from drinking the milk, unpasteurized raw milk. As soon as it gets into the human population, we could have another global bird flu pandemic that could be worse than COVID. All of the scare tactics are already there.
Yep.
And if there's one thing that COVID taught health authorities is we can take control of entire countries if we can make people scared enough.
and certainly large populations within countries who will just, run around like chickens with their heads cut off.
Look, I'm still seeing people like on Twitter who are posting, I can't believe that no one is masking.
Yeah, what's her face? Washington Post writer.
Taylor Lorenz?
Yeah, Taylor Lorenz, the old lady.
Yeah, it's 4 years later.
Still, I can't believe people aren't masking up. Like, what?
Yeah, and look, I can remember, during COVID, well, like it was 1,000 years ago, during COVID, we had stores that you have to have a face covering to go into the store. And so people were taking like bandanas and putting them over their face. Well, it's a face covering. I am complying with the rule.
Right.
Okay, sure, technically, but the rule is designed to prevent assuming that you believe masks work in the first place, which there is some doubt scientifically about whether that's true.
There's not much evidence.
Even if you believe masks work, putting a bandana over your face isn't going to work. That's not going to filter out anything. But
matter of fact, it's going to increase the viral load right in front of your face.
Yeah, but people did it. Mm-hmm. And as long as you were wearing the magical talisman, you could go into public anywhere you wanted. Because it wasn't like people were all buying, high quality masks. And
even if they weren't wearing them correctly.
Yeah, pull it down below your nose so it covers your mouth.
You need to squeeze that thing really tight. I mean, so that it doesn't. You should have a marks on your face if you're wearing it correctly.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Look at the respirators that are required by OSHA if you're painting or doing drywall or fiberglass insulation. It's not a little bandana. It's a full-scale respirator. But for COVID, that didn't matter. My problem is I no longer trust public health authorities. Oh, I used a balaclava. No, okay. Yeah, well, that's as good as anything else, I suppose. We know that Fauci lied to us about whether we needed masks. He admitted it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I said you didn't need a mask because I wanted other people who deserved them more to have.
Oh, then recently he lied about saying that, but
yeah, okay. And then recently he went back and said, "Well, I never said that," which we've got him on video saying it. God, that guy, and that's the trouble. Here is the one guy apparently who was the pro from Dover when it came to infectious disease, and he basically got to call the shots. And look,
he is the science.
This is one of my knocks on Donald Trump. He let Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci basically run the country.
Yes, he absolutely did.
And from them, we got, you have to get vaccinated and the vaccines will prevent transmission, which, by the way, they also knew wasn't true. And then, of course, during the summer of 2020, well, obviously, if you want to protest the George Floyd killing, then, well, clearly you don't have to worry about
racism is also a disease.
Yeah, racism is also a disease, right. So you don't have to worry about, millions of people all gathering together. You do have to worry about going to a funeral for Meemaw. We can't allow that. Mm-hmm. But
or church or school.
Yeah, but if you want, thousands of people to gather together in close quarters in the streets for a protest, well, that certainly wouldn't ever be a super spreader event. I mean, it's more, the social cause is more important than protecting health in that case. That's not a science. That's clearly not a science-based solution for a airborne transmittable disease.
Correct.
And so now it's 4 years later. And now we're seeing bird flu, and we're culling millions of chickens in various states. I think one of the stories here said that since 2022, something like 25 million chickens have been culled. For that, I would like to find that story, but I have 5 stories up here, so I don't know which story was which. Since 2022, there we go. Since 2022, About 22.9 million birds from backyard flocks and commercial facilities have been destroyed to keep the virus at bay in Iowa. That's 22.9 million chickens since 2022 that have been culled in Iowa alone. That number nationwide must be much, much higher.
Well, I was going to say, because I think the biggest places for chicken breeding are in Delaware and North Carolina. And we're talking like millions upon millions of birds.
One of the troubles with what is happening, and certainly was amply demonstrated during COVID, is this, what I consider to be a crisis of legitimacy among institutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I'd like to be scared about bird flu. But the same people who are telling me to be scared about bird flu were telling me to go out and protest for George Floyd during COVID. The same people who are telling me to be scared of bird flu said, oh, these vaccines will prevent transmission, when they knew at the time that transmission prevention had never even been tested for these vaccines. The same people who are telling me to be scared about bird flu are the same people who told me that COVID indisputably had a zoonotic origin. It could not possibly have come from the lab in Wuhan, despite the fact that there was a lab in Wuhan, and all of the cases that first started for COVID were around the lab in Wuhan. Ignore all of that, and we'll never know, by the way, because the Chinese successfully stonewalled any possible investigation, along with
so did Fauci,
along with friends like Fauci and his buddy Peter Daszak, who co-wrote the letter in Nature. And as we know now, even while he was trying to get people to co-write the letter in Nature, some of the people who signed on to that letter said, well, you know, really, we don't know, but there'd be a shit. One guy said, there'll be a shit storm if we blame China. How can I trust anything that you say?
That's been the problem with all of our institutions over the past couple of decades. Intelligence alone seems to have no intelligence. They have no idea what the hell's going on. And when they think they do, they're wrong. That is just a completely wasted institution at this point. The medical people, Jesus, they have raked themselves over the coals and have shown little to no, remorse for what they did and what they put everybody through.
And by the way, let's not forget the media in that. You know, we've talked about
the media. Yeah, I mean, they've been going downhill for a long time, and now they're just
first known human case of H5N2 bird flu kills person in Mexico. Resident in Mexico dies from bird flu. First human death from bird flu. Man dies from avian flu in Mexico. Except that didn't happen.
Yep.
But the headlines are all still there.
Yeah, of course. And they may have a correction, at the bottom in some print edition. But
yeah, on page D47, there'll be a retraction.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fear-mongering at its worst, and it's for a political reason. This is just pure propaganda.
How do you maintain a technologically advanced, complex civilization when every institution that you depend on to provide your sense-making apparatus lies to you?
Well, I think you reduce the reach and power of those institutions. I think they need to be much more accountable, which means much smaller. I think their budgets could all be cut by at least 2/3, and we would be just fine.
Yeah, look, in chat, it's not a matter of trust anymore. It's what we do about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is the most pressing question. What do we do about the fact that all of our institutions either fail or they creak along for day-to-day stuff, but anytime something major comes along, they're just going to lie to us. And look, that extends to the judicial system. We spent an hour last week talking about Trump's conviction on something in New York.
Right.
We don't precisely know what it was, but it sure looked criminal, so he gets convicted. Which reminds me, the speaking of the justice system, one of the cases that the Supreme Court is going to be looking at this term, and it's June. It's June 9th. We're going to get these rulings pretty quick. This federal obstruction statute that was used to charge the J6 rioters, is that statute even applicable to those rioters? That obstruction charge?
Yeah, that was brought up as part of the defenses that a lot of the J6ers presented. They weren't allowed to present all of their defenses, which is also a violation of their constitutional rights. But yeah, the obstruction statute had nothing to do with going into Congress. It had to do with it was it Sarbanes-Oxley?
Yeah, it was part of the Sarbanes-Oxley.
Yeah, and it had to do with hiding paper trails and that sort of thing. It had nothing to do with wandering through the halls of Congress.
And there was a significant sentencing adjustment for a lot of these J6 defendants.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the actual crime that they were charged with in many cases was like unlawful parading,
Yeah.
which was, nothing burger misdemeanor. However, if we can throw in obstruction, well, then we can raise this to at least a Class E felony, and we can drop these people in prison for 2 to 5 years.
Yes, which is what has happened.
For hundreds,
one of the guys,
for hundreds of defendants.
Tarico, the head of the Proud Boys, he was in Florida at the time, and he received the highest sentence of anybody.
Yes, but he sent unfortunate text messages. Don't you understand?
Right.
He was part of the conspiracy to obstruct.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think, what did he get? Like 6 years?
Something like that.
Something like that. I mean, it's a major trip down river. Let's put it that way.
It was 60 some months. I remember that.
And so the Supreme Court is now going to, and this goes back to the two-tiered justice system that we like to talk so much about. How does this get this level of sentencing other than for political reasons? And I certainly hope the Supreme Court just comes back and says, yeah, all of those obstruction charges have to be thrown out, which would release several people from prison immediately. Also, by the way, the Supreme Court is also going to do the presidential immunity thing.
It's a close case. I don't know how they're going to go on that. There is nothing clear in the law about this, nor in Supreme Court precedent. And it's an interesting, intellectual exercise. I don't know that Trump is going to win, but I don't know. Maybe there'll be at least some clarity on, where that, up to what line does that immunity apply? I mean, it's unquestionable that the president does have immunity for certain things, but between the election day and January 20th, I mean, is it the same? Is it different? Are these actions that he took, were they actually presidential actions or were they campaign actions? I don't know. It's a close call. I'm not thinking Trump's going to win. but maybe we will with getting some clarity on that.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that we find ourselves in a situation where we need such clarity.
Yeah.
Because the Supreme Court is now going to have to announce some sort of bright line rule or some sort of test. God help us all.
That's what I'm afraid of. We're gonna get another stupid test
That says, if A, B, and C occur.
right. Ah, jeez, I fucking hate it when they do that.
Supreme
I mean,
Court
how is
test.
that not legislating? That is legislating.
Yeah, so I suspect we will not get a bright line ruling. We will get a test that
Pretty
has
narrow.
To be applied.
Well, I expect we'll get a fairly narrow ruling. As applied.
It's about presidential power. I think they have to be as narrow as possible. You don't want the Supreme Court determining, I don't think, in the best of all possible worlds, what a president is immune for and isn't immune for acts in office. Because there's no way to slice that apple that down the road doesn't end up with prosecutions of former presidents for
and you cannot. Well, there's no way to delineate everything, right? I mean, there's going to be stuff that nobody would ever even thought of.
Yeah, that's why there's going to be a test. That's why I don't think they're going to come out with a bright line rule. It would be nice if they said, look, official actions taken as president are immune from prosecution. We have other constitutional remedies for that. Actions taken for candidacy purposes are not immune because those are political acts by a political candidate, not the president. Okay, but that opens up a whole can of worms, right? I mean,
because then what if it's a little bit of both?
Yeah, and hence the test to determine whether it's a presidential act or a political act.
Yes.
And of course, as we've seen before with Supreme Court tests, different circuits are going to apply that test differently, and they're going to come up with different results. This is a can of worms that we shouldn't have to open, but by golly, the Biden administration decided to open it.
Yeah. Yeah, because remember, this was Jack Smith's, doing to get this before the Supreme Court. It wasn't Trump.
Yeah, and by the way, should Jack Smith even have the office that he has is another interesting question.
I know that I think Stephen Calabresi and Alan Dershowitz, I can't remember if Jonathan Turley did, but a lot of them have urged the Supreme Court to simply say, well, Jack Smith doesn't have the power to bring this case, so we don't have the power to hear it, and just dismiss it. I know that Aileen Cannon in Florida is specifically having a hearing on whether or not Jack Smith was properly appointed, which he was not, but he was a member of the DOJ when he was appointed.
It's not only that he was a member of the DOJ when he's appointed, and the law, to the extent that it exists for I don't think it's called a special, is it called a special? It's not the special counsel anymore. They have a different name for it.
Special prosecutor, isn't it?
Maybe it's special prosecutor. And the law says that they'll be appointed from outside of the U.S. government.
Right.
However, the way that a special prosecutor gets appointed is also specified by law, and the DOJ didn't follow that in appointing the special prosecutor.
Correct.
There was no special counsel statute in effect at the time. So the additional question is not whether it should have been someone other than Jack Smith. The additional question is, should there be a special prosecutor at all?
At all, right.
In which case, that puts the Attorney General in the position of having unconstitutionally created a federal office that does not exist. Yeah. Shock, of course. I'm shocked to learn that there's gambling going on here. So that would certainly give the Supreme Court an out, right? If they could just get 5 justices to say, well, Jack Smith is not a legitimate special prosecutor. This office is not a constitutional office. It can't exist. Therefore, it doesn't have the power to bring. This should have been brought by the DOJ. This should have been assigned to an AUSA who would have carried out the prosecution in the appropriate federal district. That's not what was done. This office doesn't exist. Therefore, this question is mooted because these prosecutions are not lawful and therefore must be dismissed. At least they wouldn't have to answer the presidential immunity question, because I think that presidential immunity question is such a can of worms that almost no decision that they make would be sustainable over the long term, because it would just simply be impossible in many cases to make the distinction between, is this a presidential act or is this a political act?
It would be hard to contain it, yes.
It would be super hard to contain. I don't think this is a decision we want the Supreme Court to make. Personally, I think it would be great if they just said, yeah, this office is unconstitutional, so it doesn't exist, so these cases don't exist. And then Jack Smith can go back to whatever it was he was doing before he was appointed. One does have to note that Jack Smith's success rate in appeals in the federal court system,
not very good.
Is not very good. He lost the
McDonald case. He lost the Edwards case. He's not batting very well.
No, he's not. All right, one final thing, and that's the election. And I just thought this was an interesting sort of aside. More than half of Biden's supporters say the main reason for backing him is to oppose Donald Trump. In other words, more than half of Joe Biden's voters don't actually like him.
Mm-hmm.
They just dislike Donald Trump more, which I think is what this election is turning into. Which of these guys do you hate the least?
I mean, that's sort of what 2020 was about as well. But a little more crystal clear here. And now you've got 4 years of a Biden presidency to judge against.
Now we know what having Biden as president means.
Right.
How does that change the calculus for an election? But this does become the second election in a row in which the vision of each candidate is largely unimportant. We are now engaged in a big popularity contest.
Although Trump is definitely winning some hearts and minds in places that you wouldn't think, like Brooklyn and downtown Manhattan. Not that he's going to win New York or even any of those boroughs, but he is seeing a lot more support amongst Black men and Hispanic men. And that's scaring the bejesus out of the Biden campaign, as it should. He really cannot afford to lose that bulwark. That's a pillar upon which the Democrat presidential candidates have stood for 40, 50 years, actually longer. Really since LBJ, I suppose.
Women and minorities. That is the Democrat coalition.
Yeah. They're still winning women, I think, but not by as much of a margin as they have before. And they don't have anything to offer except that they're not Trump. Meanwhile, Trump's talking about, hey, remember like when we had cheap gas? You had a good paycheck. Stuff was cheaper. We didn't have wars going on everywhere. Remember that? We can do that again.
Yes,
and better.
We can. Although, when it comes to inflation, one notes that Donald Trump will very carefully elide past his addition of $6 trillion to the national debt.
Yes. Yeah, he was not good on monetary issues.
Well, if you want to know why there's inflation, at least part of those fingers need to be pointed at Donald Trump.
Except that inflation was a hell of a lot lower when he was president, when he left office. And then it skyrocketed because Democrats and Joe Biden started printing lots of funny money.
Yeah, but again, Donald Trump added $6 trillion to the national debt during his 4 years.
Absolutely.
So,
yes.
it didn't start with Joe Biden.
No.
And look, honestly, it didn't start with
Trump
didn't
either.
start with Donald Trump. It
No,
started
it's
with
been going on for a while.
it started with
Mostly George
honestly,
Bush.
it started with George W. Bush, George W. Bush.
Yeah, I think mostly George W. Bush. I mean, at least
Although
in the 90s,
Obama seriously ramped it up after Bush.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Well, and he also killed our GDP. So where we were limping along, after the recession, we limped along at barely European rates of growth, but kept spending more and more money. It's a nasty recipe. It always leads to the same place, and we cannot stop doing it.
No, which is why the dollar is essentially going to become worthless in the not too distant future. And
we've got it in the yield curve has inverted, so that's not a good sign.
Yeah, as much as I hate to say it, because I've always had mild contempt for the gold bugs since basically was it Soros who tried to corner the market on gold and brought gold up to like $800 an ounce back in the early 1980s. And ever since then, there's been these gold bugs. Well, you have to go with gold. It's the only store of value. And like every podcaster, every syndicated radio broadcaster always has these, well, buy gold. Here's why I buy gold. And, they drag out people like William Devaney, the actor, to talk about how important it is to buy gold. And I've always had a lot of contempt for that. There have been times, however, though, it's not unwise to have gold because it has traditionally been a store of value as part of your portfolio. But at $35 trillion of debt,
how much gold can you own?
You gotta wonder if maybe it's time to start, that money that you have in your savings account, you've been saving for 4 or 5 years, you got like $10,000-$15,000 in a savings account. If the dollar collapses, that becomes useless. But
if you warm yourself with it.
But if you buy Krugerrands,
that's true.
You might be able to sell them for whatever an ounce of gold will cost in $30,000 for an ounce of gold. Because, one of the things that we've talked about here for a couple of years when we've looked at the debt, I say a couple of years, probably many years, as we've looked at the debt constantly ramping up greater and greater and greater, is that if the dollar collapses, it's not just the American dollar that's the problem. It's all of the trillions of dollars that float around for international settlements, for international trade, because the dollar is the reserve currency. If the dollar becomes worthless, nobody's going to be doing deals in dollars anymore. All of that money gets to flood back into the United States. Yeah. And what I think about is Weimar Germany, where it was literally cheaper to burn rolls of banknotes in your stove than it was to cook with wood.
Yeah, wood costs money.
And when they stopped counting, like in 1923, the Reichsmark had fallen from 4 to the dollar in 1920 to 23 billion to the dollar in 1923, which means that all of your life savings are worthless. The only thing that you have that's worth anything is whatever asset you own. So if you own a home, okay, you have an asset that has value. It may not be as much value in real terms as it would be before the dollar collapsed, but it would be a hell of a lot more valuable than just holding cash. If you have a $300,000 home and $300,000 in cash and the dollar collapses, that $300,000 in cash might buy you a cheap baseball cap, but that house that was worth $300,000 is probably worth however many millions the equivalent of $250,000 would be.
Refugees have known this for a long time, that you convert your cash to actual physical assets in order to transport them and to actually get value for them. Taking cash doesn't do you any good.
The thing is, you can't really make time predictions off of something like this, right? Because People have been talking about the massing of the federal debt ever since Reagan ran the federal debt up from $1 trillion, which he complained about quite vociferously in 1980, to $4 trillion by the time he left office in 1988. And people were talking about, well, this is unsupportable. We can't just keep growing the debt at this rate. If the dollar is going to collapse, all the euro dollars are going to come home. We'll lose our status as a reserve currency. There'll be hyperinflation. And it hasn't happened. And now we're at 35 trillion and it hasn't happened. So you can't.
Well, the reason it hasn't happened is because every other country is even worse. Not so much with their debt ratio, but although a lot of them are, but because where are you going to put your money? You're going to put it in the United States if you can. It's simply the best place to put it. And so that has enabled us to continue along this path where we spend way more money than we can take in. And we keep getting away with it because our stock market is buoyed. Artificially.
From chat, gold and Bitcoin.
Yeah, I know people who swear by both. I'm not so big on the whole Bitcoin thing.
I'm not big on it.
It just smells scammy to me.
I have some Bitcoin and I have some Ethereum. I also have some Dogecoin. But the Dogecoin is kind of a joke currency. I bought some because Elon Musk was going after it and it started to shoot up. So I bought some and I think I may have bought $20 of Dogecoin. So I made a little windfall of, it's probably worth 28 now based on what it was when I bought it.
I got worried when I started seeing money machines, ATMs for Bitcoin. I was like, wait a minute.
Now, the trouble with Bitcoin is the crypto bros.
Yes.
They're just the worst giga-chads imaginable. And so just the fact that they like Bitcoin makes me want to dislike it. But I do have some Bitcoin. It may be time to think about buying assets. Because this can't go on forever. But you know what? It could go on for a long time. That's the trouble with monetary crises. They're not a crisis until they are.
Right. Yeah, gradually, then quickly.
Yeah, I mean, everything is fine, and then everything is awful. And it collapses.
That's why we have crashes, not slow declines.
Yeah, it collapses within months. But anyway, we've gone on for about an hour and a half, so I think that's probably enough to say that we've covered what we wanted to cover. So, Michael, have a great week. We'll talk to you
All right,
next
you too, buddy.
All right, and for everybody else that's watching, glad that we were able to actually go live where you could see it this week instead of hiding it from you last week. I'll try not to make that mistake again. Have a great week. We will look forward to speaking with you again next week. Until then, so long.